Hey y'all, thanks for joining me at Jill Cameron Creations, Inspiration and Education for Paper Crafters. Today I am doing a card for Maker Forte, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button so y'all don't miss anything. I'm using a stamp set from Maker Forte, and it is the Modern Christmas Watercolor. We're going to use the wreath and 3 of the words. First, I'm going to stamp this on some watercolor paper. We're going to be doing some ink smooshing. I haven't done ink smooshing in a long time, so I decided that this wreath is kind of artsy. It's not super detailed, but you still know exactly what it is when you see it. So I'm going to heat emboss this in some platinum embossing powder. I'm using the embossing pad from Maker Forte in the Hive collection. And the embossing powder is from Ranger. I'm going to apologize if you hear my Daisy Kitty meowing. She is being a little persistent today that I pay attention to her this morning. So I'm trying to get my video recorded and get my voiceover done, and she's just wanting my attention. So I'm having to kind of work around her a little bit this morning, so I apologize if you hear her meowing and wanting to join in the conversation there. Okay, so I went ahead and I heat embossed the wreath image twice, actually, using the platinum embossing powder. I'm stamping on watercolor paper, and it's just Strathmore watercolor paper. It's not fancy watercolor paper. As you can see, I just pull this out of a pad of paper. I get like the 10 by 15 or 11 by 15 or whatever it is, and cut it down as I need it, because I like to cut my watercolor paper a little bit bigger than what I actually need it as. So I'm just heating this until it's all nice and smooth, and then I'm going to stamp this again, and I'm going to do the exact same thing all over again. We're going to use distress inks when it comes time to ink smush. And all I'm going to do is pull out my little mini ink cubes and all of my greens, and I'm going to smush them onto my media mat, and then I'm going to spray my media mat with some water so that I have a bunch of different green colors there. I don't have the newest green color from the Distress Ink line, but I will link to it because it is an absolutely beautiful color. I just don't have it yet. So I use like Pine Bough and Mowed Lawn and some of the darker greens. I'll have all of the lists down below in the description. And all I did was spritz this with some water. And then I took a piece of the acetate. I actually used the cover from the stamp set itself. And that's how I started. And then I also misted down my panel here. And literally you just pick up the color with the acetate and drop it onto your panel. I decided to do this wet instead of dry because I wanted to do a couple different layers of color here. And this is how I started out. After I get all of the color kind of on the mat and a little bit and on my panel a little bit darker and kind of like where I wanted it a little bit more. Sorry it goes out of focus here. It'll come back in focus in just a second. I dried it with my heat tool, and then I ended up just putting the paper down onto my media mat face down, and then I dried it in between layers, so it's a lot of layers and a lot of depth in the color of this. And the more that you ink smush, if you dry between layers, especially with distress inks, they're meant to be transparent. The distress ink line is. So the more that you ink smush it, the more, if you dry in between layers, the more depth you're going to have. And I was like, okay, well, I really want some splatters on here, and it just wasn't enough on the mat right here for me to get the depth of the splatters that I wanted. So what I did was I'll go ahead and I'll wipe this off here in just a second, and I put down the darkest colors that I used in the background, and just use that to actually create some splatters on the background, so it has a lot more depth to it than just the ink color that's there. In person, and I tried to capture it in the pictures, but in person the depth of the color is just absolutely fantastic. And so I'm just going to put the 3 darker colors down and add just a touch of water to them, and then take my paintbrush and splatter this again. And I'm going to do that to, I splatter everywhere. And by everywhere, I mean, it even got on my lampshades where my 2 pendant lamps hang over me. I got paint everywhere. I didn't put this over in my box like I normally do when I do splatters, so it got everywhere. And that's absolutely fine. It just got everywhere. And so I have really dark green, a really dark, deep, saturated green here. And then that middle one is a dark green, but it's desaturated, meaning that it's not very vibrant. It has that more earthy tone to it, more brown in it. Actually, technically it's more gray in it than brown. But it has that really, really deep quality to it. And I'm just adding splatters all over it, and then I'm going to dry this. Then I'm going to take some of the Kaleidoscope powder from Maker Forte. And it is the, what's the name of it? It's called Yellowstone. I'm going to take the Yellowstone Kaleidoscope powder, and it's a really brilliant yellow. And it looks kind of like fool's gold is what the color of what it reminds me of, is that color is fool's gold. So I'm going to take that, and I'm going to use that and splatter the background with some of the Yellowstone all over the background. However, when I mixed it with my paintbrush that I used to do my splatters with, so the water actually is green, so it really goes really well with the platinum wreath there, and it just brings it out so much. So isn't that Yellowstone gorgeous? That color reminds me of fool's gold. Absolutely gorgeous there. Put a little water on the end of a block, and the end of my paintbrush, I'm just dotting it around there on the edge so that I have enough. And then I'm going to put the top back on that. And unfortunately, I think my phone rang about this time, and I use my phone to record my videos. So of course it cut off because I had to answer the phone. But I do the splatters with the paintbrush here so that you can see that. And I mix it with the end first so you can see that gorgeous gold. And then I put the end of my brush in it, and it turns the water itself a little green, but you can now see all of those gorgeous splatters on that card, and it is just so pretty. My panel was really, really warped, so I went ahead and put that through my die cutting machine. I use Spellbinder's Platinum 6, and then I'm going to go ahead and trim this down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Which means that I'm going to trim just a shade off of the sides of the wreath itself. And that's just because the wreath is just slightly bigger than 4 1/4 for the width. I trimmed off that end first before I decided how much I was going to trim off of the bottom and the top of this. And I went ahead and just centered the wreath itself in the middle of the card pretty much. And now I'm just going to trim off the sides here, and double checking to make sure that what I think is correct is correct. I'm using each of the squares that are on the Tim Holtz paper trimmer as 1/4 of an inch, so it's really easy to determine how much I need to cut off there. I decided that I was going to stamp Love, Peace, and Joy from that same stamp set in the center of the wreath here. The words for the stamp set are absolutely gorgeous, and they are beautiful fine single line. They are very, very delicate, and I went ahead and stamped these twice in embossing ink, and I'm going to use white detail embossing powder to stamp these. I wanted to make sure that I had a really fine milled embossing powder for these, because the words themselves are so fine and so beautiful that I didn't want them to look distorted. So white detail embossing powder is perfect for this. Make sure that when you are stamping with embossing powder on top of stuff that you've already done, especially things that have been set aside to dry, make sure they're dry all the way through, and liberally use your anti-static powder bag to make sure that embossing powder doesn't stick in places that it shouldn't. If it does happen to stick in places that it shouldn't, use a dry paintbrush to just knock that embossing powder off, and it'll clean right up. Here we go. Absolutely beautiful. So I went ahead and heat set that and melted it so it was all nice and smooth, and then we're going to move on to doing our berries. I attached the panel to a top folding note card, and when I did that it just needed something else, so I went ahead and I put 3 little dots of liquid adhesive in different places around my wreath, and then I sprinkled it with the red glitter. And the red glitter is absolutely gorgeous, and it just pops off of the front of this card and gives it texture, it gives it sparkle, and it gives that variation in color that I really wanted there. I did leave this to set to dry overnight. I put a piece of typing paper under it, and then I sprinkled just in the places where the glue was the glitter, and absolutely gorgeous. More details will be available, of course, over on the blog, as well as links to all of the products that I used from Maker Forte and other products as well. Thanks so much for joining me today. See you next time.